Okay. So hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Nicholas, and we'll start this off, I guess. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here. I'm going to talk about the weather and the support for democracy. So, political scientists or philosophers have often labeled civil liberties, which you can think of as this kind of umbrella term that encompasses support for democracy, as sacred values. And when I say sacred values, what I mean is that these values, you can think of them as being fixed, and that under no circumstances might you be willing to give them up. Now, of course, if you look a bit around the world, it might seem that these values are not very safe. And so this leads to this question, whether or not there are circumstances, and if so, what these circumstances are, when people are willing to give up these democratic values. And I would argue that that's quite an important question, because there are these theories in political science that argue that the level and the survival of a democracy crucially hinge on the population's support for it. So in this paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step towards answering this question by examining the role of climate change in determining the support for democracy. And I'm going to do this by focusing on 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. To be precise, right? I'm asking whether or not climate change creates certain conditions where individuals are going to be willing to give up certain trade-off or give off certain democratic capital that they hold. So I've just said the word climate change a few times, just to avoid any confusions and give it away right away. I'm going to be talking really about droughts today. Okay, what am I doing? The paper really does three things. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to ask whether or not droughts affect the support for democracy. What I will show you, which is sort of the baseline finding of the paper, is that droughts reduce the support for democracy. I'm not going to show you that, but it turns out to be the case that this is really just, or this effect is really driven by individuals who live in democracies, or it's driven by individuals who perceive their country to be democratic. The way I think about this finding is that I interpret these droughts as a signal to the population. So I view these droughts as being a signal of the government's ability to respond to a drought shock or to these natural disasters. And so in that case, what we might expect is that droughts also reduce people's perceived government ability. And indeed, I will show you that that is the case. If you think about this a little bit, in some way it doesn't really answer the question as to why would we see an effect on support for democracy, right? There might be this drought, I might dislike my government, so why don't I just vote for the opposition the next election? Why do I have to update my belief about what the optimal political system is? So I'm going to try to tackle this question in the second part of the paper. And what I'm going to show you there is that yes, it is true that droughts do reduce the support for democracy, but they only do that for individuals who are exposed to what I call autocratic governance. And I'm going to proxy this exposure to autocratic governance by looking at the exposure to ODA from China, or development projects from China. Yeah, so the underlying assumption here is that China is perceived to be autocratic. So just to be clear about what I'm talking about, essentially there are these two signals. One is the autocracy, one is the drought. The drought gives you a signal about the ability of the government to respond to the drought. The Chinese project gives you a signal about the effectiveness of autocratic governance at delivering public goods. And together, these signals jointly are going to make you update about the optimal political system that you want, right? The drought alone is not enough. You need to have the alternative as well. In the third part of the paper, I'm going to look at the behavioral consequences of this. So the idea is essentially, so far I've talked about a change in a belief. What we ultimately care about is probably whether or not this belief has some downstream consequences. I'm going to, if there's time, I'm going to provide you with one piece of evidence that I think is very suggestive. So I wouldn't take this at too much face value, but I think it's suggestive that this might be something that's worth investigating further. And I'm going to show you that this reduction in the support for democracy seems to be associated with a reduction in political engagement. And what I mean by this is attendance at demonstrations. So this relates to a very, very large literature that I do not want to get into. So I'm just highlighting very few things. There's sort of this growing literature on the determinants of the support for democracy in recent years. From what I know, at least to the best of my knowledge, this paper is the first that tries to link droughts, and by doing so maybe a bit more broadly climate change, to this kind of erosion of democracy that we've been seeing happening around the world. The other thing that I think is novel here is that the mechanism that I'm proposing, this exposure to these alternative governance systems, is quite novel. There's sort of a policy point here to be made, maybe that's very relevant at the moment, with all these 8 cuts that are happening from Western countries, right? That's going to leave some sort of a gap. And if this gap were to be filled by, let's say, China, my paper highlights some sort of a negative externality of Chinese aid that hasn't been found before. And that, of course, ties in again to a whole other literature on kind of ODA more broadly, but Chinese aid maybe in particular. Yeah.
Do you need the Chinese ODA? If you're sort of about autocracy, what about domestic governments and domestic autocracy?
Sorry? Do
you need the Chinese ODA to speak to autocracy? Because the countries that get shocked are themselves kind of autocratic or not. So there's already this heterogeneity domestically in terms of being an autocracy or not.
But it's only, so the impact only persists in democracies, and in democracies only once you're also exposed to the Chinese project. So you do need the Chinese thing.
I think, another way to do it, you have the Fuchschinden there and pin for my paper in the AR Insight, draw some, cohort information. So there will be cohorts that have been exposed to autocracy, whereas some will not. And you compare the reaction, you have that in the survey data.
I guess that I could do, yeah. That's a thing I could do. It's a good one.
Cross-sectional data, if I'm in autocracy and I'm hit by a drought, usually I'm not going to change my views very much about democracy or autocracy because by argument.
Yeah, I'm not going to show you, but that I've done. That is the case.
So I'm very ignorant about the setting, but to what extent do individuals know about these ODAs and like the extent of ODA in their country?
So that's it's a fair question, and it's actually, so I'm trying to run a survey this summer to address a lot of these things. The Afrobarometer has some questions and kind of previous views about China. I'm going to tell you a little bit when we get to this. They view China relatively well. They're aware that China provides aid. They think this is positive. So I think they are aware of this. There's a very fundamental question: do they actually view China as autocratic? I actually don't have an answer to this. I'm assuming that for now, and so I'm hoping to run a survey to get a bit more information on this. But I think people are quite aware, and if you also, I'm relatively young in my career, so I haven't been to too many project works, but where I have been and where I have seen things, like China, like in Niger, where I was, it was incredible how China is advertising things, for example. So it doesn't seem completely unlikely to me that they are aware that China is.
I have a flip side point of question. Why do you need droughts? In the sense, is it just about shocks that can come, or is it about something specific to droughts? Droughts are just a source of income shocks, right?
Yeah. So that's a good point. I think very generally, right, this idea of these two signals, it could apply to any negative income shock. You could think of trade shock, inflation, something like this. I'm going to, in the second point, try to rule out sort of the income channel that might be going on underneath all of this that maybe many are thinking about, in which case that might be a bit of a special case. But yes, I do agree that this might be a bit more general setting, or kind of theoretically this could actually be an issue that happens with many shocks. Okay. Unless there, no. Okay. So how do I measure the support for democracy? I'm going to rely on these Afrobarometer surveys. I'm going to use the geolocalized versions of these things. I'm going to rely on rounds 2 to 6. So I exclude round 1 because the phrasing of the main question is a bit different, though if I add this, it doesn't change anything. I know the month and year when these individuals were interviewed from 2002 to 2015. gives me about 130,000 individuals in 16 sub-Saharan African countries. Or I'm restricting my sample to 16 countries. These 16 countries make up a bit more than 50% of the sub-Saharan African population. So the main question or the main outcome that I'm using, stated here in the middle, provides respondents with 3 options. So option A is democracy is always preferable to any other kind of government. So these are really the people who believe democracy. Statement B is, in some circumstances, a non-democratic government can be preferable. So those are the people who are willing to give up some of their democratic capital. And statement C says, for someone like me, it doesn't matter what kind of government we have. And those are the people we can think of as being maybe indifferent. There are many different codings you could do, not just these 2. Just to give you, I'm going to use today coding 1, which just takes the first 2 statements. I'm really restricting myself to the people who chose democracy versus kind of the alternative. If you do this, you get this conditional mean where 86% of the sample support democracy. If you group B and C together, you get the unconditional mean, which tells you that 75, that's how you say it, 75% of the sample support democracy. Measuring droughts is maybe a little bit, yeah.
Sorry, going back 1 slide. In some sense, this doesn't seem like a very strong support for autocracy. People say, in some circumstances, a non-democratic government can be preferable. I mean, if everybody is under extreme hunger, or let's say there is extreme, a war or something like that.
I'm going to show you different outcomes as well.
So that's not your only measure.
It's my main one, but it's not my only one. So I'm going to show you that people are like really willing to, they actively say they want to be more likely to abolish elections, abolish parliament, abolish checks and balances on the president, which are really kind of getting rid of fundamental democratic traits.
So my question was a bit different. Maybe you can speak to that as well. This seems to be maybe more about short-run abolishment, right? Under some circumstances. Do you have a sense of whether this is also, people really change their opinion of whether in the long run you should also?
Yeah, so I try to I see this a bit as a separate thing. So I look at short-run effects. That's what I sort of think. I have looked at, kind of over your lifetime, assuming you haven't moved, you've been exposed to so many shocks. What does that do? I mean, okay, there's still this negative impact. I think it's a slightly different kind of worm because you're getting into what determines support for democracy over the long run, which is, I view this as a completely different kind of worm. And so I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. But it's really a bit separate from what I'm doing here, which I think are more instantaneous contemporaneous impacts.
Can I just ask one more related question for asking about various dimensions there? So did you ever check whether American aid programs have any impact, and in particular whether American aid programs push you toward democracy if you live in an autocracy?
Yeah, so American aid programs, to the best of my knowledge, are not as locally geocoded as this. So the thing that I'm going to show you is the World Bank as the alternative. Those are. And there, I don't find this impact anymore. So that's how the finding has changed from how you saw the paper once. So there's not going to be the same pattern that you see for China. And I have checked whether you kind of think, if you were to assume that you perceive the World Bank as democratic, if in autocracy you see kind of the symmetric finding, and that's not the case. Okay, droughts.
And so what's your theory for that?
Explanation for not finding. I mean, okay, it could be many things that maybe in an autocracy, it could be sample issues that in an autocracy you're less willing to talk. I don't have that many autocracies in my sample. Another thing, it could just be that. I don't know why would I. Okay, good question.
I mean, another thing about this is sample issue, if you look at this in democracies, right? So if in a democracy you have a World Bank project, then it feels like you should have some theory of how beliefs move. It's all about seeing well-run aid projects.
But they're just not having a negative impact. I mean, I think that's very good already. The World Bank projects just have no impact. That's.
So you have countries, let's say, where you have democracies where you have no aid projects. right? And then you have democracies, so there presumably you're saying that when you have a drought, I guess the question is in absolute terms, what happens in those countries? I feel like this is all relative to that.
Mhm.
So what happens in that base condition?
So can you say that again?
It seems like the base condition is a democracy,
Yeah.
with no aid projects. And then you have a drought there.
Yeah.
And exposed in that country, does the support for democracy?
If you're exposed to
Yeah.
a project, yes.
No,
But-
you're not exposed to aid project, there's no aid project, just a pre-post. Conditional having no aid project.
No. The drought has no impact on the support for democracy if there's no aid project.
Okay, so then if you have a World Bank, it should presumably go up. By the argument that now you have a well-functioning public good project there. If the Chinese is going to move you towards the top,
But the World Bank project is, if it's, I mean, it depends a bit on how the World Bank project is perceived, right? If you think you're living in a democracy, the World Bank is already living in democracy, why would there be a change?
there will be some people in that country who
Who don't support
believed in
democracy,
B
yes.
and they will move to A. Portion believing A should go up.
I think these are all
Yeah,
useful
maybe.
things,
I
like
don't-
talk about like what types of beliefs to elicit, it's like what do you know / believe about the aid projects around you, whether World Bank or US or Chinese? And then what do you know or believe about sort of the institutions that make those aid projects either effective or not? And so there are a whole bunch of sort of beliefs that are kind of being, they kind of accrete to some overall assessment of your institutions and what institutions might be effective to respond to current circumstances. And I think that, yeah, it's really worth unpacking.
Okay, so let me think about this and I'll keep going. Okay, let's get to droughts. So how do I measure droughts? I'm gonna rely on this index, the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. I'm just gonna call it drought index from now on. This is a continuous index, it's negative, it's standardized, it's negative and positive values. Negative values indicate wet conditions and positive values are going to be drought-like or dry conditions. Okay. The data I'm using, just very quickly, is this reanalysis data set that's been used a lot. To calculate this index, I have grid cells 27 kilometers squared, so I can merge or map my Afrobarometer respondents into those grid cells. Maybe relevant, the drought index is calculated for each grid cell in a month. And is expressed in standard deviations of the grid cell's historical mean. I'm going to use this 12-month index, which is going to smooth sort of over short-run weather fluctuations. And the summary statistics, just very quickly. So in the historical sample, you have a mean standard deviation of 0 and 1. In the mean in my sample or in my sample time is 0.4, which sort of tells you that over time this area is becoming more dry. Yeah.
So from my understanding, a fluorometer intends to have a sample that's representative at the national level. So if you're gonna respond it from that grid, it doesn't means it represents that grid. So sometimes people use post-regression stratification to actually make it representative from a lower unit. And the follow-up question is precisely when they have droughts, there's less likely to have respondents because it's harder to get there and get people to respond. So I wonder if you can say anything to it.
On the second point, let's wait for the next slide. And on the first point, so I looked into this a little bit and I sort of look at this a bit in the draft hypothesis checks as well. It doesn't really seem to make much of a difference. I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. Okay, so the main specification I run is very simple. I'm having the support for democracy of an individual I in one of those grid cells in a month year T. On grid cell fixed effects, month by year fixed effects, the drought index in this grid cell month year, and a bunch of controls, think of age, education, something like this. Yeah. So there are many assumptions that go, of course, into something like this, right? This is a cross-country regression across many years. This is really nesting a lot of things. I don't want to go into this in a lot of details, but I just want to quickly highlight three. I think third one sort of addresses the point that was just raised. So on the one hand, you need an exogeneity. The big thing probably is that we have this whole literature about heterogeneous treatment effects. This is not that easy to address in this particular case, right? Because the treatment is actually continuous. So you have a bunch of not a very clean control conditions, control group. So I do a variety of things in the paper to try to address this and show that this is not a concern. And the third thing is that we might have a selected sample because of the droughts or because of natural disasters. And I sort of think of this in 3 steps. On the one hand, the drought or a disaster can affect whether or not a survey is actually being rolled out or the timing of the rolling out. Conditioning on the survey actually being rolled out, like who can the enumerators get to, right? Does it affect the ballot because of the interviewees? And then there's kind of this third thing that we know that people adapt to climate change or to weather shocks. And so the main thing that I'm thinking about here is like migration could lead to a selected sample. So I do a whole range of things in the paper that, maybe for time purposes, I'm happy to talk about afterwards, but I do address these things and they don't seem to cause too many problems. Yeah.
Delta G is a grid cell, yeah?
Yeah.
So so if you take 2 surveys in 2 different years, do they typically survey the same grid cell in 2 separate years?
It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So the grid cell,
I'm thinking that then affects the sort of identification of this effect. If you're only ever surveying a grid cell in 1 year, then whether it had a drought in that year, what you'd ideally want is a panel of grid cells, whether they were subject to a shock in each year, rather than having grid cells moving in and out of treatment.
so there is both. I mean, there is both. There is also a panel. I mean, there is a unbalanced panel underlying this that I could identify. Question then is whether it's still represented.
Yeah, because if you've only observed it once, it's perfectly linear with whether you had a drought or not in that year.
Yeah.
You might want to think about running on the balance panel.
I've done this. There's not a big change or no change. Okay, main result. Column 1 gives you the main result. Let's just interpret this or kind of go through this very slowly. A 1 standard deviation increase in the drought index, so these are drier conditions, reduces the support for democracy by 1.1 percentage points. So what I do in every table, just to say it once, because it's going to be the same always. If you want, not necessarily needed, but scientists say, a 2 standard deviation increase in this index, you can think of as kind of 1 big drought shock. So when I look at this impact and I translate it into percentages, you see that 1 drought reduces the support for democracy by 2.5%. That's sort of the mainline finding in this column 1. And it's robust to pretty much everything you throw at it. In columns 2 to 4, I look at other outcomes from the Afrobarometer, which sort of addresses a point, at least part of a point that was raised before. And what I look at is whether or not the respondents support one-party rule. So that's a word for saying whether they support abolishing elections and parliament, whether they support army rule, and whether they support one-man rule, which is essentially supporting a dictator or abolishing checks and balances. And what you can see is that, droughts also reduce or increase the probability that you support one-party rule and one-man rule. And this sort of shows us that, on the one hand, people are consistent in their answers, and maybe another way to say this is that they understand what this is, right? This is really about democracy and these kind of fundamental things of democracy, parliament, elections, checks and balances, they want less of in response to these droughts. Yes.
Let's just understand sort of what you think is, so these are largely countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where presumably at a time of drought, if you do face an income shock, you're largely relying on possibly an informal network for sharing. So, I mean, why would you jump to the level of looking at a country level governance rather than, I mean, at the basic level, having theories on how people will think about their sharing network or their village community. It would be useful at the minimum to sort of see what happens to respondents' views of it, but it may be nice to have just a little bit of a framework to tell us why should we, I mean, I know you're sort of, what is it that would make people change their views about country government? Give us a narrative, but I'm not very sure they're the ones who you turn to for their sharing in these villages.
So, I mean, so for sure, informal networks are very important. I haven't really looked at that in too much detail. So the place where I'm trying to run this survey this summer is on where they have these two programs. One is a cash program, one is this cash for work. So it's essentially an employment program that the government rolls out once there's an issue, a big disaster or something, which trying to basically leverage the fact that there was this huge drought in 2024. So I think people do, I guess my quick answer would be that I'm not saying these informal networks don't exist, and I think they surely do, and there's plenty of evidence for this. And but I think I'm just looking at a separate question, and I don't see why they have to be substitutes essentially.
Well, it'd just be nice to then see it.
But I agree that
I mean, it'd be nice to see what in some sense is the
Yeah.
first stage, which is to say that these are areas where the droughts are happening, are areas where there is some of this public program.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could look.
Stage there at all, that is very hard to know.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, kind of, I mean, there are some questions in the Afrobarometer on like social capital, like views of your neighbors and things like this, even as that might be a hint on, because I don't think there's like detailed.
Or
neighbor-
just, I mean, even if it's narratively, but just give us a sense of, you know, what is the exposure to the state at these points in time that people are like,
Yeah.
have and, you know, less.
Okay.
It'd also be like how much of the sample is really a multi-party democracy, in fact, right?
That's, I mean, it depends on how, so it's a paper I have more on this, but it depends a bit how you define it, like these indices and
I
everything.
mean, because, well, there's two ways to interpret that, right? My one-party state is responding very ineffectively.
Okay, the other thing that I wanted to kind of hint at just in the first results was, and let's first start by looking at column 3. So the outcome here is an index, a standardized index of your perceptions of the state's ability. So these are questions on, you know, how well do you think the states can manage the economy, deal with education or provide education and health services, things like this. It's a standardized index. And so what you see is that droughts also reduce these perceived abilities of the state, or, you know, I sort of view this as a local perceived state capacity measure, if you want. And this sort of plays into this idea that I tried to have in the beginning, or state in the beginning, that droughts can serve as these signals about your government's ability. So what you see in the first 2 columns is maybe more broadly something that we would expect, that, you know, people's trust in government and trust in institutions. So these are again indices that are standardized of, in this case, it's trust in the president, parliament, and local government, but they're all equally affected. You know, decreases as well. And this might be a bit more kind of the backlash effects that we are expecting, whereas what I'm pushing for is not just the backlash effect, but it's that you're actually updating about the optimum system that you want. Yeah.
The beliefs like religiosity and like things that could explain like what is actually happening. I mean, are there any questions about religion, like
Yes, religion is not, that was my initial idea, that didn't work.
Okay, and then I have a second question, but maybe you'll talk about it. Have you looked at the experience of socialism? Socialism in these countries, because if you, like some of these connections between China and these countries may kind of, maybe you don't perceive it as an autocracy, but rather as a socialist country or something that could actually explain like an alternative that is not democracy, autocracy, but rather socialism, capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Good in some way. Yeah, I agree. I haven't looked at that, but I agree that's a good point. Okay. Okay, so far, the main result, and that there is also kind of this backlash going on, but this hasn't really explained, you know, why do we see this increase in the sorry. Yeah, believe me that lost. And here we go. So the data sets that I use for this World Bank or Chinese development projects comes from this website called AIDS Data. I'm going to go with the assumption, right? This is an assumption that China is perceived to be autocratic, and the World Bank I'm using as this placebo. I'm going to say it's democratic. I admits that there is no evidence for this, or I have no evidence. To the best of my knowledge, I don't see surveys that ask about this. So this is what I'm sort of trying to disentangle a little bit more. The idea again behind all of this is that Chinese projects, they're going to signal something about the effectiveness of autocratic governance is delivering these public goods. And sort of, I stated this in the beginning, so in the paper I go into this in a bit more detail, but in general, people have relatively positive views on China, right? And I think a good chunk of people are exposed to these Chinese projects and, and about 20-30%, and 60 to 70% are exposed to World Bank projects, and the World Bank's really much more present.
Just an interpretational point, I mean, World Bank projects are not really World Bank projects, they're government initiated. They're government projects typically funded by the World Bank. So that's a very different take on what people should infer when they see a World Bank project, because the World Bank project never happened without the government being involved.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so that might be also one of the reasons why, right? Why maybe that might be an answer to your question, because then if you just tie it to the government, if they perceive it as such, that might be a
It should
thing.
be positive, yeah, unless, I mean, again, it's.
Well, no, because they blame their government, right?
I mean, then you have to argue that these are bad projects, right? So if we assume that all projects are reasonably well delivered, then democracy, if I have a project at a time of drought, it should make me more positive if it's a case with no project.
I mean, so point taken on the World Bank and democratic governance, it's sort of the underlying assumption that I'm going here. There's a survey being written at the moment with these questions. Yeah.
Just a suggestion to address that. So the World Bank data set, when you do it by project, you can disentangle who is the executing partner. So when it's the local government, then it's difficult to infer its democracy. But if it's, let's say, bilateral aid or it represents a foreign country where there's democracy, maybe that's more plausible.
Maybe, yeah.
So maybe that's something you could do.
It's a good idea, thanks. Okay. So let's look at this. So this is kind of the main result of the main mechanism kind of showed here. So in column one, essentially what I'm doing now is I'm just interacting the drought index with this exposure to Chinese development aid. And okay, of course, there's also the Chinese dummy itself in the regression. I'm just not reporting that. When you see the first coefficient tells you the droughts have no significant impact on the support for democracy for individuals who are not exposed to autocracy or to these Chinese projects, right? For individuals who are exposed to Chinese projects, you add the two coefficients together, and you see a significant reduction in the support for democracy, right? And the difference between those two groups is statistically significant. And this holds for different radius of exposure to this, to these development projects. So in the paper, I do a lot more than just those two. Columns three.
Clear on what project exposure means? Does it mean exposed to a project in that year or exposed ever in that grid cell to a project?
So it means that so I know the time when you have been interviewed, and it means that a project is either actively being built or has been built in, I would say at most, so in extreme cases, it goes a bit longer, but at most 3 years before, or has been terminated at least 3 years, at most 3 years before.
So there is some time variation.
There might be there is some time variation, that's, yeah. And I also know, and this is gonna come afterwards, where people are actually interviewed and they're gonna be exposed in the future, and I'm gonna use that for something else.
Is there any, I mean, surely they're systematically different in a whole bunch of ways, just,
Absolutely.
you could talk about that, even possibly between World Bank and Chinese, but surely relative to places with no.
Absolutely.
Okay,
So can I postpone this to like 2 slides, because this is gonna be a. Okay, so World Bank, you see no impact, right? And so this is sort of this idea that you need to be exposed to this alternative in order to update about the optimal political system that you want. Okay. Before we get to, I guess, Michael's point, just very quickly, what you see about here is again the same 3 outcomes that we had before, the 2 trust outcomes and the perceived ability. Let's start with column 3. What you see is that perceived ability kind of follows the same pattern that we just had before. So people only update about the perceived ability of their government once they're also exposed to this alternative. Whereas if you look at the trust variables, that's not the case. You always have this negative impact on trust, independently of whether you're exposed to this alternative governance system or not. Yes.
And maybe even show it, even show us regression with any measure of economic well-being in the regression slide.
I'm not going to show you that. I mean, I have them. I'm not going to show you that.
Okay, so when you do that, what is the coefficient on the drought times Chinese project?
So droughts impact negative thing. There's no like differential thing between the two.
Go ahead.
You kind of need that, right? You need that the Chinese are responding more effectively. They're mitigating the impact of the shock, and that's why people.
But the Chinese project was there before the drought hit, right?
They're saying the reason I update positively on their system is because they can respond when there's a disaster. That should mean it mitigates the negative impact.
But they don't respond to the disaster.
So then why?
But why is that? What's the model of learning?
That you see someone else providing a school, an airport, a health clinic, they're not responding to the disaster.
No, I know, but the economic effect of the disaster should be mitigated by,
Because they're there.
because of the Chinese project,
Yeah, okay, I see what you mean, yes.
but you don't see that.
I don't see that, I think, no. Or I don't see it statistically significantly
But if
different.
you don't see that,
I see an impact on both, but yeah.
but if you don't see that, then what is the underlying reason for why I change my trust?
Well, I don't know, because it could be many things. If China builds a school somewhere, it might take years until you see the impacts. That might not really have a huge economic. I don't see that, maybe for this, I might have to kind of simplify to economic projects, to projects where it's really the case. But building a school is not clear to me that it immediately leads to like in 2 years.
Not in the story at all, right? It's just that they're building schools and that makes me supportive of autocracy and does that need to jobs.
No, because the impact, no, of course, but the impact is that during you notice this effect of them being able to provide those public goods, you notice that it's heightened during a time of crisis. Whereas I don't see this impact. I don't see that during the kind of normal times, right? The drought is basically heightening this whole thing. That's the point.
But could it be like the opposite, where it's actually, since there is no water or whatever, the Chinese dam is not working anymore, and so these places have more infrastructure than the other places because they have these Chinese projects, and so when you're hit by the weather, like by the shock, then actually like you feel the effects more because there is infrastructure not functioning. Would that make any sense? Like if we think about a dam, like this is quite easy to think about. There's no water, the dam's not working, and so these people are going to be more upset than places that did not have a dam in the first place. What type of projects? If it's schools, this probably doesn't make any sense.
I mean,
Something that-
it's a range of, it's not just schools. I picked schools as an example because it's one big thing for China, but it's not all schools. Let me think about this, but yeah, I think.
Because it's true that more generally, it's asked the question of to what extent is a drought completely exogenous, right? Which
yeah.
is really, I have no prior on, but I guess it is driven by some infrastructure development that could itself be impacted by the projects, or just by the actual current government itself.
Fair point, yeah. Okay, so let me try in the last 3 minutes at least address a little bit of the concerns that Michael raised before. So the idea is that these things are clearly not random, right, these projects. And so very intuitively, I guess, an idea of a way to think about this is that these projects might target places that have certain characteristics, and so I'm actually conflating a mechanism, and it's just these underlying characteristics that are there. There I'm making to kind of address this and looking at these anticipation effects. So given time, I'm not going to show you this, but essentially, since I know the timing of the interview and kind of the timing when these projects start, I know I can identify locations where a drought hits, but a project will be implemented in the future. Right, then I can check whether or not in those places a drought has a significant impact. And that imperfectly, but it does, there's no impact in those places. The impact of droughts on the support for democracy, again, only persists once you're exposed to these projects that have already started. So there's the other side of the same coin is that these these projects have these economic impacts, of course, locally, right? And that might be, again, conflating the mechanism. What I'm going to argue here, and this is maybe addressing a little bit some of these points here, is I'm trying to argue that what I'm capturing here is not driven by any economic mechanism, right? So what I'm going to show, or what I show in the paper, is I take employment as an example. So I say that, let's say China builds a school that's going to create some employment benefits for the local community. And I show that those employment benefits are actually in like 10 kilometers around the project. So it's going to create some sort of donut of people around the projects that are exposed, but they're not economically benefiting. And then I'm going to comparing those donut people to those outside of the donut. and I tend to exclude 1 minute the employment, or I kind of exclude employment as a mechanism. And this, of course, excludes anything that is affected within 10 kilometer as a potential mechanism. I can sort of change this radius. It's imperfect, but it sort of gets at this idea that I think was raised before. If I do this by sector of the projects, the impacts are also always the same. Last thing, if I look at political engagement, I'm going to do this very fast. Droughts increase the probability that you state that you are attending demonstrations. But once you are exposed to Chinese development projects, there's no more impact. It's not statistically significant between the two groups. So this is just very suggestive, right? But I think I'm out of time, but there is a relatively interesting, I think, correlation or kind of a story here to be mapping to the Acemoglu-Robinson theory that I think is relatively interesting, because the first coefficient sort of speaks to their thing that when there's a recession, maybe you're more likely to threaten revolution, but then suddenly when you lose support for democracy, you're less likely to kind of go into these things. But I think this is just suggestive and interesting. And on that note, thanks.